on page 63 and 64, Derrida writes, "The critique presents itself as a work, ergon, with several sides, and as such it ought to allow itself to be centered and framed. But this frame is problematical. I do not know what is essential and what is accessory in a work. And above all, I do not know what this thing is. That is neither essential nor accessory, neither proper nor improper, and that Kant calls paragon. For example, the frame. Where does the frame take place? Does it take place? Where does it begin? Where does it end? What is its internal limit, its external limit, and its surface between the two limits? I do not know whether the passage in the third critique, whether paragon is defined, is itself a paragon. To the impatient objector, if he insists on seeing the thing itself at last, the whole analytic of aesthetic judgment forever assumes that one can distinguish rigorously between the intrinsic and the extrinsic. Aesthetic judgment must properly bear upon intrinsic beauty, not on finery and surrounds. Now the example of this degradation of this simple paragon into a seductive adornment is again a frame. This time the gilded frame. The gilding of the frame done in order to recommend the painting to our attention by its attraction. What is bad, external to the pure object of taste, is thus what seduces by an attraction. And the example of what leads astray by its force of attraction is a color, the gilding, inasmuch as it is non-form, content, or sensory matter."
Essentially, what we're dealing here is the dialectic of two extremes or polarities. This is the essential view of Western philosophy, particularly in Kant's view, that is much emphasized here. So I guess Derrida's question is each the binary side in itself not stable or well-defined. For instance, in paragon itself, there could be more binary oppositions. And the same thing with the ergon, you have the same issues. If you look at the paragon, let's say a gilt frame, and depending on how the frame was gilded and how the frame was carved out, depending on the artisan's skill, the frame itself can be an issue there. And also the problem, the question from the common view, you have a very beautiful, perfect frame from the Renaissance. You put it in a very low-grade art. Now, then you look at the ergon as the art, paragon as the frame. So how are you going to decide which one still stays as an ergon, which one stays as a paragon? You're in a dilemma. You can't get out this thing. The same thing with the religious view. You have a God, and then you have beings made by God. So obviously there is the same view, the ergon and the paragon. Each of the parties cannot be defined, nor it has any stability. In Kant's view, before you appreciate the true beauty, you have to exclude your intellectual power, which ties into knowledge, ethic views, any practical observation of things. And at the same time, you have to detach yourself from your internal feelings about things. So either way, your sense, your reason are both excluded here. Unless you come to this stage, you can't really appreciate the true beauty. Derrida already asked the question. Even in this position, there should be a middle ground. The German word Mittel is the description of the situation. Then you have the true term for that. German word is Urteil, judgment. And the question again is this judgment constitutive or regulative? Does Kantian judgment provide us any a priori principles? Does the a priori provide us any guidance or any rules, any support to go for this beyond judgment? Do we have to use that to truly appreciate beauty? How do we define if we have such thing as a priori principle to lay a ground for us to proceed in order to understand the true beauty? It becomes a very arbitrary situation. So in other words, it's all preconditioned or presupposed. Nothing is truly objective. Basically sensory experience, intellectual understanding, none of that is applied to this situation because that has to be standing alone by itself as judgment. You can't have the faculties of the practical knowledge or the sensory experience as your reference. That's exactly where he's asking the question. All the questions here, presuppositions, are very arbitrary. Nothing seems to be logical or based on our common practice today. Maybe, back in the days, in Kant's days, people didn't think this way as we do, but as far as Americans today, we don't look at that, we don't think that. Well, of course, there is an issue that the Europeans always believe that the view of the world from the Americans are different from the view of the world of Europeans. So Americans don't have this, you might want to even say, given a priori sense of things, whereas the Europeans do and we don't. At this point, it really doesn't matter because things as things are, we are as we are. So no matter what you say, we needed to proceed to go forward, to understand what's going on. So obviously, Kantian's idea is not really working that well. But now why there are so many people today, including a lot of Americans, still cherish Kant as somebody very great. So how does that work? We don't read his text. Even we do, we don't understand. We're just told he's so great. You don't understand his writing only because he's too sophisticated. I mean, that's the only logical answer you're going to get. But then you really get into it. If you look at it from the pure idealistic view, which is, from the view of German idealism, you have to be pre-programmed or presupposed. Okay, I follow the map you gave to me. Then, sure. If you, in the outside view, you become an outsider, none of this thing going to work.
On page 67 and 68, Derrida questions, the formality effect is always tied to the possibility of a framing system that is both imposed and erased. In the third critique, book 1, Kant examined the judgment of taste from 4 sides. In the Analytic of the Beautiful, of the Analytic of Aesthetic Judgment, that the definition of the beautiful, 1, according to quality, is the object of a disinterested Wohlgefallen, disinterested pleasure. 2, according to quantity, what pleases universally without concept. 3, according to the relation of ends, the form of finality, without the representation of an end, finality without end. 4, according to modality, that which is recognized without concept as the object of a necessary Wohlgefallen. Derrida questions on page 69 and 70, such is the categorical frame of the Analytic of the Beautiful. Now, where does this frame come from? Who supplies it? Who constructs it? Where is it imported from? And Derrida induces, this is a legitimate operation, since it is a question of judgments, but it is a transportation which is not without its problems and artful violence. A logical frame is transposed and forced into be imposed of a non-logical structure, a structure which no longer essentially concerns a relation to the object as object of knowledge. The aesthetic judgment, as Kant insists, is not a knowledge judgment. The violence of the framing multiplies. It begins by enclosing the theory of the aesthetic in a theory of the beautiful, the latter in a theory of taste, and the theory of taste in a theory of judgment. Derrida then deduces, the definition of taste, which here serves as a foundation, is the following. Taste is the faculty of judging the beautiful. But what is then required in order to call an object beautiful must be discovered by the analysis of judgments of taste. Therefore, in the course of the final delimitation, theory of taste as theory of judgment, Kant applies then an analytic of logical judgments to an analytic of aesthetic judgments at the very moment that he is insisting on the irreducibility of the one kind to the other.
You look at the big picture here is that we follow a contradiction here. Essentially, every possible way we go, now we encounter dilemma. For instance, the idea of taste in Kantian sense. you have to have a taste in order to judge something. But at the same time, the judgment determines your taste. That's why we have to keep asking the same question. Does that mean we are giving priori principle? As such, we can continue. But obviously, that's not quite the case. At least Kant does not articulate that to you. As we read earlier, I have to mention that again. You have to exclude your sensory experience and your intellectual understanding and observation. So essentially, the idea is you want to appreciate a beauty of something. You have detached from the thing, the object, both intellectually and emotionally. Only so you wouldn't be able to come to your judgment. But then your judgment ties into layers of different qualifications. He mentioned earlier about 4 of those categories. And those 4 categories, or among the 4 categories, taste becomes something very important. But the taste also is not something as if that can be taught or can be educated. We're not told that you can be trained or educated to acquire this taste. This taste has to be a pure intellectual exercise to come to the judgment. You begin to wander. You become an acrobatic exercise in your mind. You're going over places, you come down to something and you're not sure. I always think of this picture. They said that Kant was sort of like a hermit, living in a very exclusive way of life. He did things routinely. He only walked to certain places. His house, everything has to be some sort of routinely set up. And he goes back to his desk. Everything comes from his mind. So the question is this: do you agree with the whole idea of a German idealism? And if you believe in that, then you shouldn't have too much problem to understand or to follow Kant. At this point, it's not even about whether you understand or not. You see, that's the problem. You always want to understand. Please tell me, let me understand this so I will agree or disagree. Kant does not give you anything that you can understand. But you don't seem to have a problem with that. And in fact, in some way, you deeply embodied his concept. Because you make things that works in your own mind, you don't really concern other people understand or not. If they don't, you just reinforce that. You begin to see the whole Kantian philosophy is very violent. This kind of metaphysical or intellectual violence is very frightening, actually. And because of that, if you look at Kant, and then you look at Hegel, then you look at Nietzsche. On one hand, Nietzsche is completely different from those 2 guys. His emphasis on the individual as the self is just as violent. Because Kant emphasized some sort of a superior, a priori existence. That somehow this priori existence that will be instilled in you after a certain time of hard work with your mind, you'll get that. And then once you have that, you become great. Hegel, on the other hand, stretched that superiority, that invisible superiority to the idea of spirit and freedom. And then he gets into the dialectic to work out that way. And essentially by Nietzsche's time, it's not that Nietzsche claimed that God is dead that because somebody killed God as an accident. Rather, Nietzsche's original meaning is that God no longer guides us anymore. He didn't mean that God deserved to die. So now he's dead. He's saying God is no longer there for us, as if we're abandoned by God. So from that sense, Nietzsche is not really so much against the God. Rather, he's just saying, hey, God abandoned us. That's why he's dead. He continued to be dead because he's not there anymore. What does that say is that you as an individual, you had the chance to become a Superman. Whether you can or cannot, that's a problem. I mean, that's what later the French guys begin to say. Essentially, the modern man take place of God. So now everything begins to make sense there. The whole German thing is the emphasis on the power of mind, which is really something you are very familiar. This is how you brought up. You may denounce philosophy. You may denounce Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, and all the German guys, whatever. But you can't denounce yourself because you are a German idealist. focus on your mind so much as an American. You think you have nothing to do with the European tradition. You may not have anything to do with the European cultural traditions, but you are deeply embedded in still the German idealism. All in your mind is your mind. All your life is your mind. That's what Derrida is trying to work here, to question this mind power. And every possible way, you're stuck in a contradiction. Because this mind power, this idealism, has to be constructed or worked out at the base, at the foundation of hierarchy. So the bottom line is the hierarchy.
According to Kant, in the third critique, in order to distinguish whether or not a thing is beautiful, we do not relate the representation to the object by means of the understanding with a view to knowledge, but to the subject and to its feeling of pleasure or unpleasure by means of the imagination, united perhaps with the understanding. On page 71, Derrida writes, "The relation to the understanding, which is neither certain nor essential, thus furnishes the frame of this whole discourse, and within it of the discourse on the frame." On page 73, Derrida says, "But it so happens that it is this analytic of judgment itself, which, in its frame, allows us to define the requirement of formality, the opposition of the formal and the material, of the pure and the impure, of the proper and the improper, of the inside and the outside." However, Derrida argues, a frame is essentially constructed of therefore fragile. Such would be the essence of truth of the frame, if it had any. But this truth can no longer be a truth. It no more defines the transcendentality than it does the accidentality of the frame, merely its paragonality. And Derrida concludes, philosophy wants to arraign it and can't manage it. But what has produced and manipulated the frame puts everything to work in order to efface the frame effect, most often by naturalizing it to infinity, in the hands of God. One can verify this in Kant. Deconstruction must neither reframe nor dream of the pure and simple absence of the frame. These two apparently contradictory gestures are the very ones, and they are systematically indissociable of what is here deconstructed. If the operations engaged and the criteria proposed by the analytic of the beautiful depends on this paragonality, if all the value oppositions which dominate the philosophy of art before and since Kant depend on it in their pertinence, their rigor, their purity, their propriety, then they are affected by this logic of the paragon, which is more powerful than that of the analytic.
Derrida really has a problem with the polarities. He used to call that the old grip. The pairs, inside, outside, essence, forms. That's what comes into the picture right now. It's interesting that he's trying to figure out the essence of the beautiful, or at least he's trying to follow Kant to figure that out. But he spends so much time on paragon. He switches from paragon to frame. So frame is something much more visual to common reader, or it's easier to deal with. You begin to wonder, okay, we're talking about art. We're talking about the beautiful. In our common sense, art has least to do with the frame. Because anytime we want to talk about art, want to talk about the beautiful, we have to talk about the true art, the ergon. You want to look at Rembrandt's painting, you're not going to talk about how that the painting ended up there, or who made the frame, and how much time the museum people spent to clean the painting, to hang the painting on the wall, and trying to figure out what's the best light, or which frame fits the painting the best. No one ever talks about that. Well, not in the sense of philosophical discourse. You want to talk about aesthetics. You want to talk about the definition of the true beauty and how we define the judgment. And Derrida keeps bringing the idea of paragon and frame, that without the frame, without the paragon, what's the point to talk about art? That's his opposition to the traditional view. The opposition of formal and the material and the pure and the impure. Think about why the Impressionism made such a big deal at that time. Put yourself back in time. You can't use your current mindset and your understanding to look at it. It was a very, very big deal because back at that time, people were painting in a simple way. or like a photograph. And all of a sudden, somebody slashed a whole bunch of paint, very sloppy and very impure. He wants to put this painting in the museum. That's like somebody has a truckload of garbage. It's going to dump in the middle of a museum floor. Say, that's my work. That's my art. Although we're very close to that. Not quite dramatic, but that's what they were doing. So now you understand this whole modernist movement. People are doing those crazy things in their art making. Well, that's because if you get inside of the pure theory, this is what you see. Kantian aesthetic view of things. Even back late 1800s Impressionism time, everything was still dominated by Kantian aesthetic view. You think about it, a couple hundred years later, Derrida is raising this question here. And even this, most people still don't want to read it, don't want to take a look at it. That is to say how deeply you're branded with the Kantian dogma. So the Kantian idea is full of contradiction and illogical, but also has been dominant for hundreds of years. What are you going to do about that? I mean, basically, that's what he's trying to tackle.